We are honored today to host a panel featuring Ahmed Shihab El-Din, Adel Iskander, and moderator Will Yeomans. Mr. Shihab El-Din is a journalist and currently produces and co-hosts The Stream, a new web community with a daily TV show on Al Jazeera English. Before joining Al Jazeera English, he worked as a reporter and producer for the Doha Film Institute, PBS's award-winning documentary series Wide Angle, and the New York Times. Mr. Shihab El-Din's work has been featured in the Huffington Post, Frontline World Online, Time Out, and Washington Week. Mr. Shihab El-Din will be joined by Adel Iskander, a scholar of Arab Studies who teaches at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and the Communication, Culture, and Technology program at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Mr. Iskander's work deals with media, identity, and politics, and he has lectured extensively on these topics at universities in over 20 countries. His latest publication is an edited volume entitled Edward Said, a Legacy of Emancipation and Representation, and his two forthcoming works are books on the role of new media and dissidents in the Arab world. Finally, our two panelists will be joined by Will Yeomans, a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan and a new media consultant. Mr. Yeomans currently works with the Institute for Palestine Studies in Washington, D.C. He also founded the irreverent and activist multi-author blog Kebab Fest. His writings have appeared in Arab Media and Society and other journals. For those of you who are watching our live webcast, you can send your comments and questions to the panel while watching online by tweeting to @PalestineCenter. Also, you can participate via Facebook in our live chat roll. We will begin with remarks from our speakers, followed by a question and answer session. Without further ado, please welcome Mr. Shihab El-Din. Thank you.
Well, it's an honor to be here, frankly, and I'm going to try and be brief because I have a tendency to ramble, but also because we have a show later and I know there's probably a lot of great questions. And I'm much more interested in answering Will's questions and also your questions. But I thought I'd just talk through some trends that are important to highlight in terms of answering the question, what role has social media played in terms of trying to bring an end to the Palestinian occupation and to work towards the Palestinian plight and freeing the Palestinian plight. I'm going to start a bit self-referentially with some tweets, because rather than me tell you what role I think social media has played, what I did is, because on our show we have an online community that we use as a abundant wealth of interesting topics and anecdotes of people around the world, including in Palestine. So I asked them to answer the question for you, and I just want to talk through some of their tweets. These are people who are very active online, who use social media to try and bring an end to the occupation. So we have Yasser Tine, who said, "I'm able to interact with activists on the ground of conflict and have a valid source for facts way before most news networks." So that's one answer. Cheesecake saying, "I personally think Twitter is the most powerful tool in social media in bringing an end to the occupation because there's several random people who learn different things and get their news there first." Raal Tamimi saying, "Using social media to battle Israel's strong PR," which we all know they invest heavily in. Social media is the #1 activity on web use traffic to market and organize. And then LSAL92 using a specific anecdote that we saw in recent weeks, which is the video of the attack which surfaced online of the flotilla. It was broadcasted on the news. That's one way social media has helped, by spreading information before the news. And then second, the Gaza war anniversary. Every year on December 27th, Palestinians and activists get together to get Gaza trending with tweets of those who were murdered, the names, therefore humanizing them. Now, I'll end there because it's really important. I think the most important thing that social media does, ironically, even though it is in the virtual realm, is it really can humanize people because of the speed and the ease with which information can travel without the kind of paradigms that we're accustomed to in the mainstream media, especially in the West. I want to talk through some of the challenges in the context of the Arab awakening, which I'm sure we're going to get to, because we all saw what happened in Egypt. We all saw what happened in Tunisia. So perhaps the most pertinent question is, why has there yet to be an Arab Spring or a Palestinian Spring or a revolution inside of Palestine? Now, one issue is exhaustion, right? This is a long conflict, decades old, and we've only seen more settlements and more advances by the Israeli government and military and more oppressive policies, expanding colonies into the West Bank and also into East Jerusalem now. Now, the reason I bring this up is because it's become clear that even when the U.S. tried to be a broker and tried to focus on settlements, we saw Al Jazeera release the Palestine Papers, but for a long time we've known that the Israelis, we could, I guess, say, have been less than willing to negotiate and compromise. So if we take that element out, we can now focus on what do you need for any sort of revolution to succeed. These revolutions in Egypt were accelerated and they were amplified by the fact that people were able to mobilize and organize using social media, Twitter, Facebook, not just to, share and post information to the wider world to see, but also to organize tactically. In the early days of the revolution in Egypt, they were on the ground using boats to circumvent police and so on and so forth. Now, in Palestine, unfortunately, there is something missing that I think is at the crux of this entire conversation. And that is that there's no goal. Now, you might think that that's me being blasphemous as a Palestinian, standing here telling you there's no goal, because what is the goal? Free Palestine? Sure. End the occupation? Sure. Bring justice to the people? Sure. But if you really boil it down, in Egypt, it was a popular uprising, much unlike other uprisings we've seen where it's not based in sectarian, divides or religious divides or even political motivations. They all had one goal, and I'm using the Egypt example, I think, because it's the most familiar and arguably the most successful in a short period of time. Their goal was to oust Mubarak. Well, the Palestinians don't have one leader that they're trying to oust, and moreover, their leaders were arguably democratically elected in a way that other governments in the Arab world, especially Egypt and Tunisia, have been living under these false kind of fraudulent elections and whatnot. So the question is, do Palestinians rise up against Fatah, against Hamas, against Israel, against the UN, against the West, against the Arabs? And even though we've seen attempts, which I'll get to a bit later, I'm trying to condense everything in my brain so as to save time. Unlike in Egypt, there's no unified goal, and there can't really be a unified goal. We've seen the Third Intifada Facebook page. We've seen calls on May 15th to commemorate the Nakba to have people march towards, their homeland. Well, the people who founded that movement, the Third Intifada, which was later, it's worth mentioning, taken down by Facebook, even though their policies as to why they took it down are not clear, but that's an entire other issue. We're actually not living inside Palestine. And many of the people who signed up, hundreds of thousands of people like this Facebook group. Let me just try to show you very quickly. This is their website, right? Calling for them to march. And I was taken aback with how structured and organized they were. In this country, let's meet here. In Lebanon, let's meet here and plan, and I don't know what. Well, in Lebanon and in Jordan and elsewhere where they were being called to march, and in Egypt, when they get to the border, who are they faced with? They're not challenging the Israeli forces. They're the soldiers in Lebanon and Syria. So these are just some of the issues that are at play in terms of why, I guess we could say, social media has been not as successful as in neighboring countries or other Arab countries. And feel free, someone needs to cut me off because I'm not looking at the time. So I'm just going to let you guys do that. But I just want to jump around a little bit to the idea of the reconciliation, because many people are saying, a lot of the calls that we saw in early March were to try and bring Fatah and Hamas together, right? A lot of people, including one young man who's 16 and who's, Palestinian himself and who was on our show on the stream on Al Jazeera simply by the mere fact of the fact that he participated in a call out that we did. And the reason I mention that is because that's indicative of why there is hope, and there is hope that social media in the future, which hopefully we'll get to a bit later, can bring about to hopefully some sort of progress in terms of the Palestinian plight, in the sense that there's not only a democratization or a potential for democratization in the Arab world, including in Palestine, but there's also a democratization, whether we want to admit it or not, of media and of voices and of influence. And I think that is helping embolden and galvanize the Palestinian cause, because the conflict and the argument in terms of how it plays out in the media is changing. It's no longer as one-sided. Of course, it still is very one-sided. But I just want to say, with regards to the reconciliation and the elections, Palestinian youth leaders who have mobilized, the ones who have been behind a lot of these Facebook groups, if I can just show you another one of them right here, you know, the Nakba Day protest, this is like the checkpoints in Qalandia where people were asked to travel. Again, you know, they essentially are the ones who elected these leaders, and so because of that, reconciliation in the view of a lot of the protesters would free up new elections and greater accountability. But the question is, are you know, a lot of the criticism saying, okay, you're focusing on reconciliation. Of course, reconciliation is the preliminary step to bringing about any real change. But by focusing on the leaders that you've already elected, you know, that's very different than fighting against an oppressive dictator or an oppressive leadership. In fact, what's happening is you're asking and looking to your leaders for support, which you may not be getting. But a lot of people are criticizing that movement, which is a necessary movement. And this is the kind of paradox, I guess you could say. They're saying you're taking your eye away from the prize because Israel is the occupier, correct? So if Israel is the occupier, but you are arguably oppressed by your own situation and your own government and leadership, then who do you focus your efforts around? And where do you focus your efforts around? We saw that the flotillas, you know, made a lot of garnered a lot of international attention, largely because of social media. I mean, sure, Al Jazeera and other networks play a role, and we all know that this story is not balanced in terms of the larger mainstream media. And of course, social media played a role. Independent citizen journalists, activists who are uploading, you know, videos to YouTube of, you know, the water cannons and so on and so forth. But also just live tweeting. I mean, you know, we even have this one example where, you know, there were reports that the Rafah border was opened. You know, in any sort of a debate when people now discuss after Egypt's revolution whether or not Palestinians are in fact occupied, or, you know, Gazans, let's say, they say, well, the border with Rafah has been opened. Well, it's been opened and then shut and then opened, and then, you know, Hamas got angry because Egypt closed it without telling them, so they closed their side. So one way where social media can play a role is in trying to bring some sense to the complexities and the you know, the kind of hearsay, where in this story it says, traveling to the border, Palestinian bloggers challenged mainstream media reports that the Rafah crossing between Egypt and Gaza was open. Because what is more powerful than a picture? Or what is more powerful than a series of pictures? And, you know, we've seen this across the Middle East, in Syria, where the government's, you know, denying the fact that there's, you know, human rights violations and arrests and protests. And then you see when you see a plethora of videos coming in, it's hard to argue with that, even if you can't source them. So the reason I'm making these kind of, you know, broadening it out is because it's not just the fact that there's the lack of a unified goal. They also struggle with this incredible PR machine. You know, and I'm not going to get into what Israel has done, but one role where social media on the Palestinian front can play a really, really crucial role is in dispelling some of the rumors and some of the quote-unquote hasbara, I believe it's called, in Israel, where, you know, we saw that there was this gay young actor who pretended to be an American, who his name was Mark, who was protesting. He's a gay rights activist, saying that he had offered to help flotilla organizers to support, you know, in solidarity with the Palestinians, a network of gay activists, but they said, oh, because you're gay, we're going to turn you down. Trying to just diffuse the entire story. You know, and I'm not saying this guy was necessarily paid, although there were allegations that he worked for the Israeli government and that the government knew of this story and that they tweeted it out from several ministry accounts and from government accounts. But these were all things that have happened for decades, but never, I'm going to be quiet now, but never before has there been an opportunity for a 16-year-old who is in Jerusalem, who cares so passionately about this story, and who has contacts who can help dispel these kinds of misleading media stories that the Israeli government is directly involved in driving. So I'm going to end there, and I'm going to hope to answer all your questions.
Thank you very much again for the organizers for inviting us and putting together this incredibly timely and very important panel. It's going to, you know, Ahmed is a very tough act to follow, but nevertheless, I'm going to try to take a jab at this without trying to reiterate some of the same points that he's already made. For the most part, I think it's important for us to take a step back and think about the terminology, the lexicon, the language, the ideas, the discourses that we use to describe the social media revolution. There is a tendency for us to either mischaracterize the idea of social media, or to assume that media were never social until the emergence of Facebook, the internet, and various other technologies. Understandably, nowadays we can follow the news on, let's say, the flotillas, or the sort of the Palestinian Day of Rage on March 15th, or the Gaza marches, or any of those sort of activist sort of hotspots, using hashtags and using Twitter feeds. But nevertheless, there was a mechanism for the distribution of information that preceded this, and that was efficient, but did not possess the same capacities that we have today. So I want to take a step back and really have us contemplate what it means to be using the terminology of social media. All media is, by definition, social. When the Gutenberg press first, started the printing press, the whole idea was to try and disseminate information as wide as possible to a larger swath of the population, to include one into their constituency, and to expand their reach and political influence. For the most part, that's precisely what Twitter and what Twitter and Facebook do for the Palestinian freedom struggle, as well as most of the other sort of uprisings in the region. So I want us to think about what the terminology of social mean, and also the very notion of new media. What is new about new media? Of course, I don't want to fall into the one side of the spectrum. I know you hear this all the time, and people vacillate and gravitate back and forth between either arguing that social media are the be-all and end-all, and they are the determinant of these revolutions, and then, of course, there are those who dismiss them entirely with the assumption that that revolutions have existed long before the existence of the internet, and so they're easy to dismiss. So I want to sort of try and position myself right at the center of the spectrum by arguing that new media have provided us with certain capacities that are impossible to overlook. The first is the ability to decentralize the arenas whereby information is created. So audience-created content is the bottom line here. So rather than have ministries of information, institutions, state institutions, or subnational institutions in charge of the production, these centers are now being challenged by individuals. So we see the footage, the content that's coming out of various places. Ahmed mentioned the Rafah border, a single image documenting the fact that the Rafah border has not been opened, as opposed to most of what the Egyptian press has been trying to argue, is an immediate sort of refutation of whatever the Egyptian government has been trying to do. Incidentally, yesterday, a member of the Supreme Council for the Armed Forces in Egypt visited the United States and is here in Washington, D.C., and spoke at the U.S. Institute for Peace, and confirmed to any sort of American lawmakers who might be concerned about the Rafah border that it's actually never been opened. That it stayed exactly as it is. Nothing has changed. Policy is exactly as it is today as it was during the Mubarak era, and there's no reason for alarm. So that is a reaffirmation of some of the things that the social media activists have been advocating or arguing or trying to point out all along. So one component is decentralization. The second is amplification, that the message can travel farther, but can also cross genres. A message that remains online is no good, even when it comes to revolutions. So in the case of Egypt, you've got 20% of the population has access to internet on a regular basis. Unless you're able to bring in the majority of the population, it will remain revolution in a teacup. So it was all about basic organizing and getting message across, whether it's SMS, whether it's going out and distributing pamphlets or gathering people in the streets, and that is a very important component. And then last but not least, it's the ability to expedite the message. So it's amplification, decentralization, and the ability to distribute the message very swiftly. And of course, there's no reason for me to explain why that is the case. But the near instantaneity of messaging is a huge advantage for most of the organizers. In some cases, it skews the revolutionary fervor in favor of those who are calling for an uprising. Another example of that is what's happening in Egypt now. Most of the online quote-unquote revolutionaries are advocating a more critical stance vis-a-vis the army, whereas the majority of the Egyptian population is still a little bit behind on this argumentation. And so you're swaying back and forth. They're trying to to advocate this message and to really showcase the problems behind military rule. And it's not resonating just yet. So there is sometimes a disconnect. The ability to cross over between genres, between formats, between styles is the indicator of success. The other problem, too, that I think is very, very poignant when talking about the Palestinian freedom struggle is the idea of which came first. Did the Arab Spring come first and therefore invigorate the Palestinian desire to utilize social media in such a way so as to undermine Israeli occupation and non-representative local rule, or is it the other way around? Did the Palestinians inspire the Arab Spring? And I'm going to argue to the latter. I know it sounds a little bit strange, but I actually believe that to a great extent, a series of conditions have made the Palestinian freedom struggle probably the earliest of all major social media phenomena. And one has to look at the major characteristics of what makes the Palestinian freedom struggle online the most compelling and most interesting. First of all, they're facing what is seemingly unsurmountable difficulties. The first is the level of defeatism that Ahmed referred to, the feeling that, there's fatigue, we're exhausted, we've been doing this for an incredibly long time. The fact that the realities on the ground are intractable. The fact that there's a disaggregation of the population, there's divisions within the ranks of the protesters, within the ranks of the Palestinians, that there's an incongruity between Palestinians, whether they happen to be in exile, in the diaspora, or in Palestinian neighborhoods and various neighborhoods. The sentiment in Gaza may not necessarily be the same sentiment in some parts of the West Bank. And how do they define adversity before they even start challenging it? What is the immediate problem? Is the immediate problem the rule of Fatah and the rule of Hamas, or is the immediate problem the rule the Israeli occupation? So all of these are incredibly problematic. But the key point here, and the reason why social media has been incredibly vital for the Palestinians for the last, I would say, probably 10 years. I mean, even from the days of the creation of the electronic intifada, you have to remember that there was a moment where electronic intifada came into being precisely because institutions on the ground could not actually present open, freewheeling discussion about issues that pertain to the Palestinian liberation struggle. So the social media on Palestine galvanized activists around the world, including many of those individuals who have now decided to take their battle against authoritarianism, against tyranny, against dictatorship to their home countries. So many, in fact, I need not go very far. One of the administrators of the We're All Khaled Saeed page that called for the protest movement in Egypt was working at ADC for some time, Arab American Institute, and was heavily involved in Palestinian activism here in the United States, and partially, learned everything that she knows about organizing from this particular maelstrom that exists here. So it's important for us to note that because of the limitations that were presented to the Palestinian liberation struggle on the ground, there was a necessity to utilize virtual space, this parallel environment. And in doing so, there is a capacity building approach that is now bearing fruit. So when you look at how does one organize a flotilla? It's just a very interesting idea. I mean, you've got people from 20 countries gathering literally online, convening, discussing, using whether they use Google Docs or Facebook or Twitter, they've used every mechanism imaginable at very, very low cost to organize what amount to a very ambitious project. And it's a project that continues to grow. So when the first flotilla came about, there was the impression, this is a sporadic incident. Well, now you've got fleets of ships. I mean, this is a very, very instrumental effort. And arguably, of course, there are state sponsors to some of these efforts or support and advocacy for some of these projects. But nevertheless, it has more to do with individual capacities in an incredibly decentralized fashion. Even when you look at the latest fleet of flotillas, which has not been able to get to Gaza, At the very least, what's happened between the initial the first flotilla and now, I mean, it's a very, very short time period. I mean, we're talking about 12 to 18 months, right? In those 12 to 18 months, a fleet was assembled. How does one do that? Without the use of social media, this is practically impossible. So I want to say that even though Palestinians are facing layers of problems that they have to be able to challenge, nevertheless, the capacity exists. And the capacity exists because these are learned behaviors and learned activities. Nobody works with social media better than the Palestinians as far as the Arab world is concerned. But the problem has been being able to identify a singular adversary in the easiest possible way. Mubarak regime was very easy to criticize, and at some point it had lost all of its friends. It had no more allies anywhere except for perhaps friends here in Washington D.C. that continued to harp about how it was not dictatorial and other. Yes. So anyway, but nevertheless, it had lost all of its friends, and once there is virtual unanimity in cyberspace and on the ground across the board, then nothing can really change, or that's when everything has to change. I'm sorry. Now, is it possible for the Palestinians to reach a point whereby there is that level of consensus and unanimity? On March 15th, it appeared as though there were the initial indications that something like that could happen. There were attempts on the part of Palestinians living around the apartheid wall to somehow enter. And of course, we are all familiar with the Golan Heights breach into the occupied territories. Now, in this case, I think to a great extent, the Israelis are very well aware that this might pose the greatest potential problem in the future of the confrontation, the long confrontation between Israelis and Palestinians, if unarmed civilians in their tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, decide to make an open attempt on all borders to cross. How do you deal with that? And this is exactly what the Egyptian regime, the Tunisian regime were incapable of managing. How do you articulate a popular argument against that, first of all, on a media level? And then secondly, how do you create a campaign strong enough in the social media to undermine that when numerically they're so much more advantaged? And then thirdly, how do you actually engage with it on the ground? So, these are the struggles that they have to deal with. Whether or not there is the capacity to reach that sort of threshold, that tipping point, that is what remains to be discovered. But nevertheless, all the components are essentially in place. And one need not go far. The Israeli press is replete with discussions on how to address this potential threat. But at the end of the day, we've seen the power of social media when it is combined with traditional media and very basic human will. Thank you.
I think these were two very interesting presentations, and my questions are to help round them out or help kind of point out a couple things that we can also sort of think about in terms of how social media can also be important, but also what are some possible future limitations that we face. So one thing I'm thinking about more, you guys I think have really given good examples of social media as a tool of activists, as something that helps movements and plays a role in movements. But what about at a more basic level, something that might be just as important that people who think about policy and activism sometimes overlook, and that's the question of identity. Palestinians as a diasporic population, displaced, transnational, all over the world. To what extent does Facebook and these kind of sites, YouTube, become a site for like identity maintenance, identity formation?
Okay. Should I speak into a mic? Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know if it works.
Is it on?
Probably not, but everybody can hear me. Right?
There you go.
Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. Now amplified. No, I think it's important for us to be able to note that since 1948, Palestinian identity has become incredibly enshrined. The notions of oppression and dispossession, connection to land, those are things that I think will express themselves regardless of what medium is being utilized, or what format, or what text, or what style is being built So I don't think that the social media are an absolute necessity to be able to maintain that. I mean, if you travel to any of the small Palestinian villages that are, in Israel proper today, you will find that these identities are very much in place in the absence of the social media. But the important component here is the ability to create some degree of continuity between what appear to be disparate identities. So connecting the local to the regional to the global. And in this case, the Palestinian identity is one that brings together all of these at once. Ahmed,
Please.
yeah. So I think to a great extent, the social media has been able to overcome the sort of the geographic divide, the separation that exists between communities and various places, and rather than entrench the identity, but be able to create sort of a common bond between these identities. So something like, take for instance rappers, the rap group that you're probably familiar with, that we're all familiar with, them, right? They're from Israeli territory now, or Palestinians from Israel proper, or improper, and their popularity is literally a result of a YouTube video initially posted some years ago called Min al-Irhabi, who's the terrorist, and their success online, their success on YouTube, catapulted them to international fame / notoriety, and of course they've had to deal with that as a consequence. But nevertheless, they've been able to articulate Palestinian identity in a different way as time has gone by. The more they've traveled outside of the territories to global audiences, global Palestinian audiences, their language has changed, their articulation has changed, the way they describe themselves and the struggle of Palestinians has also changed. So this continuity is developing because all of a sudden these disparate communities that realities on the ground, as the Israelis like to call them, have separated them, and they're now able to bridge over those divides.
What I'll add, using the anecdote of Dam, is I was working for the Doha Tribeca Film Festival. So Tribeca, from New York, you plan to bring it over to Doha, and Dam closed during our opening film festival. So they came from Palestine, and they performed, and you can imagine that the audience was high level execs from the Tribeca crew. So Bob De Niro was there and others, and so that in of itself, it's a bit off topic, but is I think one example where you see they achieved notoriety through the use of social media, as many artists in the West now also do, and then are able to connect. I mean, it sounds cliche and cheesy, but connect on a visceral level, through their performance and rap with people who otherwise on the Lower East Side, Lower West Side of New York City would never hear of Dam. So it's just, those are small little anecdotes. I do want to just go back a bit, unless you, just very briefly to what you were saying about the March 15th movement. They really focused and tried to boil it and isolate everything down to the reconciliation above all else. These are the people who were, very much from the same background as the same people who mobilized the Egyptian uprising. They're affluent. Some of them have even studied abroad. And then they come back or they're there or from abroad. They tried to make it about reconciliation because they recognize that it's, divide and conquer is a very old and very effective combative tool, and that's what Israel has been doing in many, many ways. And if, you're divided and there's no unity, you can't uprise, you can't do anything. Your voice is weaker, right? We were waiting for that critical mass in Egypt, and they reached it now. So the question is, will Palestinians ever reach it? And I think one thing that's often neglected, frankly, by President Obama himself in his first speech to the Middle East. I'm not just trying to take any opportunity to criticize him, but I was very surprised that although he mentioned the civil rights movement and although he focused on nonviolent protest, he didn't emphasize it in his speech. And I think it's perhaps because the U.S. wasn't necessarily prepared, and I'm going to start to get a little bit off topic, but I would have hoped and expected that he would have highlighted and recognized the role of nonviolent protest. And I think this also goes back to what Adil was saying about, did the Arab uprisings and awakenings inspire, and will they inspire a Palestinian uprising, or has a decade-long struggle, 60 years and plus and counting, inspired the actual Arab awakening through a very long history of nonviolent protest that has been squashed and suppressed for years. So I think it's just interesting to note that people are struggling to find unity and common ground. And amongst the diaspora, I myself as a Palestinian living abroad, I'm also an American, but when I talk to people on the ground, including the 16-year-old kid who I keep harping on, who's actually there and who's sharing and sending links to a documentary that he's funding on Kickstarter that's reached $46,000, that's being made by a Jewish young filmmaker. The first time I went to Jaffa, where my grandfather is from, was through meeting a guy named Skandar Kopti, who is a Christian Palestinian filmmaker who created a film called Ajami, and which even the film itself relied on social media to create the film in terms of how they audition their people. So there's so many disparate examples of how on an isolated level there is a progression in terms of the Palestinian plight as a result of social media. However, as we said, it's tough to make it a collective movement.
Now going back to the question of the future of social media, especially as an activist tool, there's two possible problems that I want to propose to you and see what your response are. The first is that social media generally are private sector goods. They're corporate, and they're going to have shareholders, most of the larger ones, and they're going to be subject to institutional pressures from states. And states also will learn how to use social media in their own ways. They might be a little behind, but they have learning curves, and they can increasingly use social media for surveillance, for setting up fake, protests and then arresting everyone who shows up. To what extent do you think these are possible dangers for the future of social media as activist tools?
Who wants to take a jab at that first?
Well, I'll just quickly say, the Israeli government is not immune to any of this. I mean, they, like many other Arab governments, are recognizing, and including the U.S. government, the power of social media to mobilize people, to influence people, and to, change perceptions. We've seen the U.S. government, invest heavily. We've seen Obama and, Facebook have all sorts of secret meetings, whether they pretend that they're transparent or not. I think the risks, you wanted me to talk about the risks moving forward? Yeah, I mean, we've seen throughout the Arab awakenings, targeted phishing operations in Syria and Tunisia, people actually tracking down activists based on IP addresses and Facebook logins, and the government, frankly, fooling some of the activists into giving them their login information. And we saw the only time Facebook, unlike Google and Twitter, ever got directly involved in any of these Arab awakenings was in Tunisia, when they came to the aid of these activists and created a safe way for them to log in, where they were basically not going to be susceptible to government targeted phishing operations. And it's important to say, as you're right, Google and Twitter and all these other companies that have been the major platforms, let's say, in terms of these Arab awakenings, are too being used in Palestine and by Palestinians across the world. But Google and Twitter took a much more active role. They created, when Mubarak shut down the internet, they created Speak to Tweet, where people could call in and, they could spread their views. Now, I think Egypt, in a lot of ways, historically has a very different, reputation. It's kind of been sensationalized in the U.S., their allies versus the Palestinians. So there's a lot of, the reason I'm saying this is because I think that in of itself does affect the way these companies react in a time of conflict, and how willing they are to get involved, and on which side of history they see themselves on. I think the Palestinian situation, we've seen, Facebook repeatedly take down websites. We saw Coldplay endorse music video that was created in England by many people in terms of on their Facebook page, and then in terms of freeing Palestine, and it had a lot of that kind of rhetoric. And we saw that Facebook made it for temporary blocked the ability for anybody in the world to post that link. And Facebook took down, and iTunes, actually Apple took down the Intifada app, it's a fine line to there's obviously ways in which messages can still be co-opted, and the power does still lie in a large part to these companies, and they are obviously American companies. I mean, it's a very convoluted issue. We only have a couple of minutes. I'm going to let Adil talk. But what I will say is you should never underestimate ever the power of individuals who are like-minded and who are using platforms like, you can still blog, if you don't want to use YouTube, you can use the Arabic version. It's called Ikbis. I mean, sure, it's not as big, but there's always a way, and I think that's one lesson that I think we can safely assume we've learned from the Arab awakening, and that it applies to the Palestinian situation, which is, sure, try and turn off the internet. We'll still find a way to circumvent your suppression.
Ahmed nailed it on the head, but I'm going to add a couple of really quick points. I think it's important for us to look at these corporations as pragmatic entities as well. When they feel as though it would be a loss for them to interfere, that's when they won't take action. In the case of taking down the various pages, in the case of, in fact, in the case of Egypt as well, about a week and a half before January 25th, Facebook shut down the Kulina Khalid Saeed page on the fact that on the argument that it was a violation of the terms of service by request from the Egyptian government, and they reinstated it after. I mean, basically what they did was they gave it to the protesters on a golden platter. They said, okay, we have a policy issue, and we want to be able to bypass it, but you need to meet certain requirements. Make sure that there's an actual living human being administering this page, and we will bring it back up. That is not the same thing that they did for the Palestinian page.
I just want to add, sorry.
No, absolutely.
Facebook's policies have been extremely inconsistent. At times, unlike many others, and it's worth everyone taking this away and talking about it at your dinner tables, because I've actually, and this might work against us in our show, but I just very quickly say we went to visit with them when we were creating the show, and it was very much a walled garden. There were it was just a very odd corporate atmosphere that I felt was very counterintuitive to what one might think a platform like Facebook or Google or Twitter would be espousing.
But at the end of the day, the issue of pragmatism, I mean, these companies will not try to jeopardize what is lucrative to them. If there is a possibility that there might be a mass exodus out of their platforms, then it would be a serious issue. For Facebook, for instance, anything that smells of privacy violation, they are absolutely horrified of. I mean, take, for instance, Google+. And in just a few weeks, they've already been able to amass 20 million followers or 20 million members, and that's quite significant. So there's a possibility of an exodus out of all of these. I mean, look at MySpace. I mean, MySpace is probably dead underwater now, as is the owner. But the issue here is how far they are prepared to go. If there is momentum, if there is human will, if there is the continued decentralization, and actors on the ground, as Ahmed said, are continuing to work to produce content, to post it, this will be almost too large for them to be able to control. It's easy for them to deal with a single Coldplay video, but what if you've got 350 artists all posting on their pages? What do they do in such a circumstance? And how do they justify it vis-a-vis other artists promoting other causes? Let's say, the famine in Somalia, or in the Horn of Africa. It's going to be very, very difficult for them to work with it. So it is about pragmatism. It's pragmatism for the protesters. It's pragmatism for the companies. And there is a middle ground. The middle ground is human will.
Quickly, a shameless plug, he mentioned Somalia. That's actually the topic of conversation on our show today. So for all of you who want to see how social media factors in there, you can. And I just want to say, he mentioned Google Plus, and Adel did so rightfully, and it's really important. One thing Google Plus is actually doing in terms of their strategy is they're trying to force Facebook's hand at being more transparent, not just in their policy, because Google runs on a platform that's, all open source in the sense that they've put their entire search database as part of the internal engine of the social network Google+. Facebook, on the other hand, everything is internal, everything is within Facebook's quote-unquote walled garden. So Google+, a lot of people are, experts, much bigger than me, are saying technically that they're trying to force Facebook's hand at realizing that you need to be more open.
Inshallah. We're ready for Q&A now, but I want to thank you guys for answering those questions. Okay, do we have the microphone ready? Okay. In the back first.
There's a hand on your right. Come on.
Okay. I'm Kate Gould from Just Foreign Policy, and I was wondering if the panelists could speak about the issue of trying to use social media to affect U.S. policy in changing U.S. support for the occupation. Specifically, I also wanted to mention that with Just Foreign Policy, we're planning several social media actions around the anticipated U.S. veto of of the anticipated Palestinian application for membership for statehood recognition at the UN, and we were thinking about doing a virtual sit-in at the White House website. We've done various social media kinds of actions in the past, and we found that it's a good way to get. While the administration is so difficult to direct advocacy efforts at, in contrast to Congress, for example, but that social media provides an creative venue to do it, and because these Facebook pages for the White House or the State Department, they have such a wide audience, and it's all just so visual, so it can be a fun way to work on that. But just to hear if you have any stories that you'd like to share about that issue, about what we should be doing on social media.
I'm gonna start off by saying that there isn't unanimity on the issue of how to deal with the anticipated United Nations. I just read Ali Abu Ni'ma's article yesterday, about how it would be catastrophic for the Palestinians to actually go ahead with this. So there's a spectrum of opinions, and so once again we're going back to this original problem, which is, do we have enough of a consensus to actually advocate for a particular line of activism in support of a particular topic? Okay, you have a follow-up.
Okay, I'm just kidding. Ooh, this isn't working. All right, well, I'll just project.
No, you should use the mic for
because
the
it's recorded,
online
right? Well,
watchers.
in that case, I won't use the computer. I just quickly want to say Adil's totally right. It's become a mess of a situation in the sense that there's no real one clear approach that will serve the Palestinian interests. I would be misleading you if I pretended I knew of one. But what I will say is that here, you don't always have to, and this might sound outlandish, but I'm not entirely sure, and I'm sure a lot of people disagree with me, that the U.S. Needs to be pressured or might really play a central role in any sort of resolution to the conflict. That might sound crazy, but I really do believe in individuals supporting different initiatives or programs that they believe in, and sure, the U.S. is one of the biggest obstacles in a general sense, but perhaps for that reason you need to pursue new alternative ways of bringing about an end to an ongoing issue, because so long as there's one point of thinking, so long as the U.S. is a key player and the U.S. domestic politics in terms of interest in the Jewish lobby and whatnot doesn't change, then neither will the situation. So focus less on the U.S. pressure, and I know that's not what a lot of Palestinian activists would say, but maybe it's one solution.
Okay, I got the microphone back because I just want to quickly say that, but I would think that as U.S. citizens, that our primary responsibility is about changing U.S. policy, and that I would think that a unifying point would be that whatever different political parties and whatever Palestinians do, that the U.S. should not be obstructing their efforts to gain international.
I agree.
recognition.
I'll just quickly say, the same tactics that are used across the world. The boycott movement is extremely powerful. It's all in relative terms, but you can even find ways of doing that here. You can appeal to your, just mobilize just in the same ways that people did in Egypt. You can't only use social media. Social media, as Adil said, was the Gutenberg press. It is whatever tools are available to you. Now we just have more tools. So it's just about organizing and finding ways of bringing people like, these audience members in the front who I assume don't have a Twitter account in on the planning and mobilization.
We had a question back here.
Thank you. You all touched a bit on the diaspora, and especially the situation of Palestine with so much Palestinian activists being in the diaspora. I wondered if you could talk about the dangers of social media and organizing these kind of protests from outside, encouraging people to take these movements when they are not the ones actually at risk. They're asking people to walk toward the borders and face the military of their border countries, but they're not the ones who are actually doing it.
Could we maybe take one more question so we
Yes.
can
Yeah.
get more questions?
As somebody who did my best to revive my poor Arabic during the events in Tahrir, I found myself explaining a lot to people that there was something besides we're all Khaled Said, and pointing to Kulina Khaled Said, and wondering if you could talk, both of you, about the English-Arabic identities of social media among the Palestinians, and how many people are out there, the pros and cons of going beyond the Arabic-speaking community and the watering down of a message in English versus the benefits gained. Just something on that English-Arabic dichotomy.
Ask the second one. I'm going to answer your question first. First of all, the linguistic, of course, English is the lingua franca. It dominates the online spaces. The majority of those who are online, in the case of Egypt at least, many of them are adept with the English language in some capacity. So it's actually been the other way around. It's the attempt to translate content from English to Arabic, but at the same time, they're also using what people describe the script is Arabizi, which is Arabic in the English in the Latin script, and so I think since the revolution, or beginning with the revolution, or perhaps even during the early days of the Kulina Khaled Said campaign, there was an active attempt on the part of almost every online activist to improve their English, especially those who are their Arabic, especially those who are in the diaspora, so that their messages are translatable. I can tell you personally, I now use the social media in Arabic more so than ever before. So people are developing this sort of adeptness, and it has a lot to do with being able to expand your message and amplify to a larger constituency. And of course, there are studies now being conducted at various sort of academic centers about the new sort of language that's developing online. There literally is a new sort of social media Arabic that's developing, and it's still being studied. We're not sure what it means. It's again incredibly decentralized. It's very interesting. It's very creative. In some cases, it's not modern standard Arabic. It is not Fusha Arabic, and sometimes it's not even dialect. It is a combination of all these different things. There's an increase in the level of vulgarity as well online, and that's being studied. I mean, what does this mean? What is it a way to gauge and forecast public dissent? This level of vulgarity, where does it differ? And also the Islamicization of the Arabic language online. So all of that is very interesting, but it's important to see that Arabic is spreading online significantly. You look at Wikipedia.
Arabic to English.
Yes. Of course, because you're trying to mobilize an Arabic-speaking public. But in addition to that, you also have a significant rise in the number of Wikipedia entries in Arabic over the last 6 months or so, and has a lot to do with people deciding that they were going to go online. There are 5 million new Facebook users from Egypt in the last 6 months, and that's a significant number as well. So the uptick means that a lot of the early adopters are the early adopters. The laggards are catching up.
I quickly will add, because we're running out of time, that my Arabic's much rustier than my English, but as a result of following these revolutions and whatnot, uprisings on Twitter, I've had to improve my Arabic, and I can understand Tunisian more or less in its abbreviated, odd, form that Adil was talking about. But you make do with what you have to do. But it is worth mentioning that Arabic is quickly and very, very, very rapidly not surpassing English, but increasing in terms of its use, especially in Northern Africa. It's true that English was the more kind of accepted, especially since these technologies, you have to understand as well and remember, are relatively new. So technically, there were a lot of issues in terms of displaying Arabic characters when you retweet them, when you use third-party sites like TweetDeck and other, Hootsuite and whatnot. But now it's all becoming very accessible. And I just want to, quick shout out, because it's very important. When I was 19 and still struggling to write in Arabic, my friend, and his name is Habib Haddad, he's Lebanese, he created something called Yamli. Yeah, and Yamli is a transliteration service which changed my life. And actually, basically all it is for you, I'm sure it'd be very helpful. If you know how to say something in Arabic, you type it in using English characters, and a very intelligent and sophisticated tool instantly will write it in Arabic for you. So it's also a tool that can be used to help teach people how to use Arabic. And then the last thing I'll say is that, should we answer? Do you want to answer her?
I'm going to say one quick point on the issue of the technology. Incidentally, Google has tried to actually outperform Yamli, and they've created Google Translate, which, given the fact that it's becoming really, really popular because a lot of people are trying to type in Arabic more so than ever before, they're deciding that starting December, they're going to charge people to use it. So boo-hoo to the corporation in that sense.
And this probably not public. Yeah, there was some sort of negotiations between Habib and Google several years ago, but I don't want to end up in court, so I'm not going to say what they were. But it's very interesting. If you ever meet him, you should ask him yourself.
Okay. I know.
I think we have time for
Ahmed
one more
has a
question.
We haven't answered that question.
We haven't answered her question. Go ahead, please.
Okay. This is the eternal problem of who takes responsibility for what action. In the case of the Egyptians, of course, the Egyptian diaspora were very actively, as was the Tunisian, very actively involved in trying to sort of foment activism in their respective countries. And of course, those who faced the live bullets and the rubber bullets had to make the ultimate sacrifice. And this is a burden of responsibility on the part of everybody else who wasn't. In the case of the Palestinians, sometimes diaspora is, or in most cases, it's a forced exile. It's the inability to go home for many of them, so they can't physically participate in some of these protests. But it's something that comes with a level of self-criticism. I'll give you an example. Tamim al-Barghouti, for instance, a Palestinian Egyptian poet who teaches at Georgetown University, he wrote a poem calling on people in Egypt on January 28th to come out into the streets and face the live bullets. And if you don't come out to protest, if you don't come out to Tahrir Square, then you have disowned your own family, you've disowned your country. I mean, literally. So it's that type of language. And he was doing it while outside, and it hurt him terribly. He wanted to go back and couldn't. He was afraid he'd be arrested on the spot, and he wouldn't make his way to Tahrir Square, this epicenter of freedom. So it's a psychic battle for almost all diasporic communities who are dealing with revolutions of this sort.
I know we're running out of time, but I have no problem being 8 minutes late to the show. I'm sure Jen will disagree, who's my producer. But I just quickly want to answer that question very briefly, because I think that's the biggest challenge, and anyone who says otherwise is wrong, I think, frankly. But I will point to the Libyan example, which is, where Libya has a very active and very different, but still very active diaspora that now is being drawn upon in terms of, trying to sort out the very messy and complex situation there. But I have several friends who actually did live in the DC area who now have gone to Libya. Young, entitled, relatively wealthy people who don't need to be there, but who are there. And I remember, I'm not Egyptian, but I grew up in Egypt for 9 years. And, even myself, I was so frustrated that I couldn't be there I could have, but, whatever, within our little, lives that we lead. So I think it's, you should also remember that there were the flotillas, but there's also the flytilla. I don't know if you heard of that, where there was, several hundred people trying to fly into Ben Gurion Airport and then later on to go elsewhere, and they were denied entry and they were put on a blacklist. And this is another example of how Israel uses Facebook and Twitter to compile lists of activists who are tweeting about this flotilla and of traveling. Sure. And then denying them entry based on, speculation, and then submitting, not only we saw that the Israeli, I don't even have this here, the Israeli minister sent a letter to Facebook's founder, Mark Zuckerberg, asking him to take down several pages, but the Israeli government also asked airlines to not let passengers board on the implication that they might be up to something bad, even though there's no evidence. And of course the airlines, most of them, including Air France and several other European airlines, abided by the Israeli requests. And so there were people who had these tickets who were denied entry, and there were people who then went to get refunds for their tickets, and then the police barricaded the Air France places. And even though these are isolated incidents, and perhaps some of you didn't know about this, these are all examples of how, with time, these stories are becoming, more apparent and more eyes are seeing them. And so I think there's a way in which people can perhaps be part of the struggle or the fight without necessarily saying, you guys go march to the border while I have my coffee and tea and whatnot.
Mariana, do we have time for one more question? Okay. The woman in the blue was waiting very patiently in the front row.
Ahmed, I found it fascinating that you emphasized the what you see as a lack of a common theme, and that's something that I've felt was lacking. And I have a suggestion. There was a man named George Antonius who wrote the famous book, The Arab Awakening. It has this resonance between the present Arab Awakening and the fact that this started, he wrote this book in the late 30s, 1938, 39, I think it was published. And I think it could be a theme in the sense that it pulls together the longing for such a long period of time, most people think of this as a a new sort of phenomenon. It isn't new. So that's just my suggestion, that you might use this man as a reference point to bring some centrality to the issues.
Thank you. Yeah. Question?
Could I preempt for
yes.
being her partner? NGOs are what I'm interested in at the present time, and you saw the New York Times article regarding the Para Center going across the wall. This is sort of direct involvement of social media in getting people to talk to each other. After the wall was built, we all know that there was a complete lack of communication between Palestinians and Israelis. Would you comment on that? And you've dealt with individuals using social media around the world and diaspora. What about the NGOs? Is there a movement that gets the NGOs into using social media to promote their particular issue, whatever that issue might be? We're having a November conference on this subject, so I should say that this is a very personal thing to me, but I think the NGOs are something that have sort of been ignored in all of this.
Well, thank you for the question, Mr. Bird. I'm sorry, we're out of time, so do you guys want to say something really quickly, 20 seconds each?
The only thing I'll say is I think, an NGO is very similar to any natural, organic collective coming together online. I mean, it's the same thing. It's just an NGO is perhaps a more traditional, more established, institutionalized, well-funded, structured version of that. I mean, that is what's happening essentially on social media. So these are all NGOs, and I think NGOs naturally are inclined to look to these tools and are using these tools to promote not only their own work, but to be innovative, because unfortunately, despite their perseverance, many NGOs have not succeeded in their aims and goals, and perhaps through social media and incorporating some of these new models, they'll be able to do so.
I'm just going to add one quick point in saying that when looking at how NGOs use social media has a lot to do with particular sort of country of interest. So if you look at Egypt and Tunisia, for instance, most NGOs that were doing something that was functionally beneficial for their respective societies and found the regimes or the governments to be incredibly restrictive and prohibitive had to use social media in some way. So if you look at the human rights organizations in Egypt, I mean, they are incredibly adept at using social media. In fact, they used the social media to call for the protest. So you had the same actors, the individuals who were involved in sort of the activism, and then they were also working in these various NGOs and civil society organizations. So the social media is not alien to many NGOs, but the official NGOs, and this is the point where one has to distinguish between official NGOs, which are essentially government NGOs, non-governmental, governmental organizations, and independent NGOs. And independent NGOs working in tyrannical, dictatorial, authoritarian environments tend to turn to the social media as their only outlet, their only avenue for mobilization and for getting their messages out, including reports on human rights. I mean, look at, for instance, the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights. I mean, they are able to get out, to release reports 48 to 72 hours after every incident that happens in Egypt, and it's deployed instantaneously online and circulates very widely, makes its way into the printing press, and then is on TV. So they know what they're doing with the social media. So long as they're independent and they've constantly tried to circumvent power, they know what they're doing.